All right. So first of all, welcome to the tutorial on when multiple agents care about more than one objectives, and obviously why you should care yourself as well. I am Diederik Roijers, and this tutorial is co-presented by Roxana Rădulescu, who's here in front, and we are from the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, which is a university that is solely named in Dutch, because once you translate it to English, there's another university with the exact same name, but then in French. Because we're from Belgium and we had the nice language wars, so if you translate the university names, then there's going to be hell to pay. Good. The tutorial will roughly be structured in the following way. We have 3 parts. So I'll be presenting the first part, Roxana will be presenting the second part, and we will share the third part. The first part will be on how to motivate these settings and the basic concepts of what will happen if you have multiple agents and multiple objectives. Then Roxana will present the taxonomy and different solution concepts that result from these definitions. And so that will practically lead to what actually constitutes a solution to a multi-objective, multi-agent problem. And then finally, we'll present some of the latest results and open challenges in this field. So let me get started with the motivation and basic concepts, and I'm just going to start off with a simple example. Let's assume that you're going to the conference, and you have a couple of different options to go for. You can go by taxi, you can go by tram, or you could go walking. And there's 2 players, so you are staying at your hotel together with somebody else, and then you're going to select which things you are going to take. So the taxi is actually a lot cheaper if you travel with the 2 of you, because then you each pay half. And then if only one person takes a taxi, of course, you pay more. However, so the taxi takes 5 minutes, the tram takes 15 minutes, and if you go walking, it takes 35 minutes. And so you have multiple objectives. So that is firstly the cost of your trip, and then you have the time it takes you to get to the conference. And of course, you aim to minimize both. And then if you have this nice setting where you have 2 players, and you can put it in a matrix like this, so you have the payoff for each agent. So the first one is for the row player, and the second one is for the column player. And this leads to what you would refer to as a multi-objective normal form game. It's basically the same type of formulation as a normal form game, just that the payoffs are now vector valued rather than single valued. Are you all familiar with the concept of a normal form game? Yeah. Good. So now this seems relatively easy, but then why is this hard? Well, in a normal form game, you know that the rewards that you can get are public, of course, because that's a formulation of the model. But now, in a normal form game, in a multi-objective normal form game, this is still the case. We can observe these factors. We know all the possible outcomes. However, these 2 players might care about the different rewards that you can get in a different way. For example, if we're from different universities and they budget things differently, then I might have like a travel budget for the entire conference, or they say each trip must be under a certain amount of money. And this might actually change how I can perceive these rewards, because, for example, if I am allowed to spend only €8 per trip, then the taxi option is definitely going out of the door, right? However, if I have a full budget for the entire conference, even though it's the number of days times €8, then I might decide to take the taxi once or twice, right, together with the other person. Because the average will still be under these €8. So how I'm going to apply the utility function, how I care about the different objectives, is going to be determining in what the optimal action is, or joint strategy is, in this case. But, and this is very important, this utility function is quite often private. So if you're playing a game with other agents, then it's quite common that you know how the rewards will be in different objectives that you might have. But how people care about that is usually information that is unique to the agent. And they might actually not even want to divulge that information, simply because that information might be exploitable. So there's a quite difference in paradigm between a multi-objective setting and single objective setting. Also, this utility might be nonlinear, which leads to all kinds of different issues later. So the entire point that I'm trying to make here is that a multi-objective normal form game, even though it's still a very relatively simple model, is significantly harder than a single objective normal form game. So then, why should we do it? And the first part of why we should do it comes, of course, from what real life is like. So there are just problems that you encounter in real life that typically just have multiple objectives. For a close-to-home example, what are your objectives for writing your current research paper? Well, you might care about a lot of things, right? So publishing as soon as possible, the quality of the conference, collaboration potential, flag posting, like I want to be the first to publish on this specific topic, increasing the funding potential. This is especially important for senior researchers because they might use it as a proof of concept that they can use as in a grant proposal later, or just finishing your PhD as soon as possible. It's also very important. And so these are all very normal objectives for publishing your research project. And if you, and I assume that you're probably all writing or doing some kind of research here, you can imagine how much you care, or you have some feeling about how much you care about these different objectives, right? So this is just a very multi-objective problem and this is basically what real life is usually like. You have all kinds of different things that you want to achieve with the things that you're doing. But the thing that makes this more interesting is that you have a feeling about how much you care about all of these objectives, but now how about your co-authors, right? Your co-authors probably care about the same things, though of course they might already have a PhD, but they might still care about you finishing your PhD. But they have different interests in the different objectives, right? So even though you agree on what the objectives are, they might care about this in different ways. So the first part of the argument is that why we need multiple objectives is just that most decision problems in the world have multiple objectives. Another important part of the argument is that we cannot scalarize this to a single objective problem before solving it, right? So a priori. And this has several reasons. Firstly, you might have an unknown, uncertain, or private utility. And so in multi-agent settings, you quite often will have a private utility function. But you can also just not know it or not be able to express it. There might be some uncertainty in what the preferences actually are. So if you have artificial agents, then you're trying to serve as a human, and this human might have some, and you might not know exactly what the human wants. Then there's nonlinear utility functions, which if you apply it to a problem can actually change the type of solution that can come out. And it's a bit more technical argument, but this causes that you cannot, this is quite often causes that you cannot scalarize the problem a priori. Changeable preferences, which is also something that happens quite often. People might change their mind. And then if you've spent all your time on computing a scalarized problem, somebody thinks, well, I'm not actually satisfied and I'm going to change my utility specification. Then you need to do the whole thing over again because the solution doesn't apply to the new one. You don't know what went wrong. And there is just the potential for adjustability and explainability and oversight for your research purposes. And this is especially, this is becoming more and more important nowadays, for example, also in respect to legal requirements, that if you have an artificial intelligence that is involved in the decision making, that you're able to explain why the agent took a certain decision. And it will not do to say, well, the value of this thing in some specification of reward function was 2.35, and the other decision had a value of 2.37. So I took the second one, and then what does that mean? And that's a very different thing than having two objectives saying, okay, for example, I have a cost that I'm incurring in euros, and I have a time cost that I'm incurring in minutes, and that is way more explainable to actual human decision makers, right? And so you might need to do the explicit model explicit modeling of multiple objectives simply because you need to be able to explain what your agent is doing. All right, and so all of these things is, and especially with the second point, this is the last point that I'm making, is that to scalarize is to throw away information. Like you have different events in your system, and if you scalarize it to a single path, then you just throw away a lot of information. All right. So I already hinted at it a bit, but AI has an ever-increasing impact on society, right? So there are more and more AI systems that you are currently dealing with. You have your search engines, you have your, but also insurance companies use AI nowadays to do with their intake. So AI has an ever-increasing impact on people's life. And so this makes the ethical aspects of such a system more important, which makes human-aligned AI more important, which has been articulated very well by an excellent article by Peter Van Plu et al. 2018, that aligning AI to human preferences is by definition a multi-objective problem, because unless, of course, the problem is extremely simple. Like if you only have money to optimize, it almost never happens, but then you can get away with it. But as soon as there is any ethical consideration that you need to make, like the impact on people's life, then you're in a multi-objective problem quite quickly. And Peter Van Plu actually outlines how this, if you take different ethical frameworks, that all of these ethical frameworks lead to some kind of multi-objective problem. And explainability is more and more important also because of legal frameworks that are incoming or actually already out there. That if you use an AI system, you need to be able to explain the decisions that your AI system makes. Well, then you need to be able to say, okay, why did we prefer one solution over another? Which will typically need to be explained in terms of meaningful objectives and values that can actually be understood, for example, by a judge and or a lawyer. And then, of course, there's a very big factor in environmental concerns, like there's usually no longer that you just can get away with optimizing money, but you also need to have your environmental impact in check. And so this will more and more often become an explicit objective of an optimization problem. All right, so by now I hope to have convinced you that a lot of problems have this. To give you one more example, for example, something that I work with in my research is electrical vehicle charging, and then what you have there, well, you have meeting the demands of the system, so everybody needs to use energy, like they want to do their laundry, they want to charge their electric car, they want to have the lighting on, etc. But you want to minimize the costs to that, and of course you need to prevent grid overloads, or at least the risk for grid overloads. So this is a very typical multi-agent, multi-objective problem, because you have a lot of different people who all have their energy demands that they need to meet. They all want to pay as little as possible, and none of them is benefiting from a grid overload. Right. All right, so now that hopefully I've convinced you that you need a multi-objective approach, then how do we start modeling and dealing with multi-objective, multi-agent systems? So first thing that we should realize is that the user utility is central to this modeling aspect. So if we are encountering a problem that has multiple objectives and multiple agents, then the first thing we should consider is like, what does the user care about? How is their utility derived from the solutions of the problem? Now this seems a bit like an open door, but it's quite often ignored in papers in the literature to just go straight from, okay, we just pose this solution concept axiomatically and we solve for that without actually explicitly considering why the user, how the user derives their utility from the solutions. And we will get back to this in detail why this is actually very important, because it will have a huge impact on what type of solution concepts that you should use. And so you might be optimizing for the wrong thing if you skip this step. One important thing about user utility is that this usually stems from meaningful objectives to the user. So this needs to be explainable things in quantities that a user can deal with. Now this does not need to be that it is very understandable to you as an AI researcher, as long as it's understandable to the domain experts that are actually using the system, right? Um, but if you talk to people who are involved in such a system, they can typically explain to you quite well what they care about and what units this should be measured in. So for example, if we are working for a municipality and they want to have pollution levels in check, then they have these different types of poisonous gases, and they express this in parts per million or parts per cubic meter. And of course, this doesn't mean much to me as an AI researcher, but it does mean a lot to someone who does environmental policy. So the first thing we should do when we encounter this problem is identifying objectives, and this typically involves talking to the people who are actually responsible, the responsible people that use the system. And then together with them, just go through the events that trigger the rewards. So what can happen that will make these rewards occur? And so this is definitely a very important step in modeling your system. Then you can, and you need to complete this step before actually going any further. Of course, you can iterate on it. It doesn't mean that after the first modeling attempt that it's fixed, but in the end, it needs to be a system that has meaningful objectives to the user that they can fully use in things. To give you an example of that, it might not be fixed. So, for example, we had a problem where we're measuring pollution levels. We aim to minimize it. Now, it's all very nice and splendid. And then at some point, they were not satisfied with some solution. Why not? Because the pollution levels were on average fine. It's just that around schools and hospitals, they needed to be even lower. I'd forgotten that in the first iteration. Okay, so that's a new objective where you say around these special areas. All right. So once you've done this, we can move on to what type of model we can then use. So even before, like actually modeling it into a multi-objective normal-form game or any of the other models, we like to finish this really well identifying the objectives. Then there is the decision theoretic problem setting, which leads me to this very nice Venn diagram, which probably contains a lot of properties of decision problems that you might have encountered in the wild. So the very most general problem is the multi-objective, partially observable stochastic game. The more general the model, the more terms we usually use, right? And so this basically means we have a sequential problem that involves multiple agents. They can't observe everything at the same time. So they don't get to observe the entire environment. So for example, this happens if you have a dog fight with multiple air fighters, right? They don't see everything, and they get to interact with each other through a system. Then there are all these more restrictive assumptions that you could make that leads to simpler models. So, for example, if it's fully cooperative, then you get the multi-objective, decentralized, partially observable market decision process. If it's fully observable, then you get a multi-objective stochastic game. If it's stateless, then you get a multi-objective Bayesian game. And then our model that we are using most as an example here is the multi-objective normal form game, which is both stateless and fully observable, but not necessarily fully cooperative. So we will use this as a running example, but just keep in mind that there are different or more general models that are out there, but the same type of solution concepts that we will be presenting during this tutorial will apply to these other things as well. Mainly because if so you can involve stasis makes your planning problem more difficult, but it doesn't change what you need to optimize for usually. All right. So one of the things that we should realize about these models is that the differences between these models are based on the rewards. If it's fully cooperative, it means that every agent gets the same reward factor for every time step. And in observations about the states. But the user utility is not in here yet, right? So these models are named for properties of the reward function and the observation function, but not, and the state space, but not the user utility yet. And this is, of course, something that we do very much need in practice. All right, so let me get back to this example. What type of setting are we in if we are doing if you are writing a research paper together with a bunch of co-authors? So if we go back to the Venn diagram, then we have these different properties. Is it fully observable? Yeah. Is it stateless? So, or do we need some kind of sequential planning? I'd argue that it's sequential because you can submit to one venue first, and then depending on the result, you can have a strategy for submitting somewhere else, etc. And then the most difficult question is it cooperative? And so everybody does get the same reward, so because everybody shares the outcome. Like eventually, it will get published at a certain venue, and that will give you a reward in all of these objectives, right? So according to the Venn diagram here, it actually seems cooperative. But then, of course, the question is it truly cooperative, though? Because, as I mentioned earlier, the utility that the different co-authors might have from this setting might be very different for the different co-authors. So even though they might share the entire reward, all the reward factors that might come out of this problem, they might care about them in a different way. So, so even though the model with which you would probably model it, so that would be, what would it be? So we have the fully observable, stateful, and cooperative. So that would be the multi-objective, multi-agent markov decision process. So according to that, it would be cooperative, but then if we have the utility function to account, then we actually care about different outcomes in a different way. So this is a bit of uncomfortable fact because that is not standard included in a model. But you will need to include it in order to be able to get to a proper solution concept. Now, how do we go through that in a bit more theoretical way? We assume a utility function for every agent, UI. So this is the utility function that each agent has, which maps a vector to a scalar utility. What this means is that it will impose a total ordering on all possible outcomes. Right. So if you have a utility function that can map to scalar value, then I can always tell you which outcome of two alternatives I prefer. Or that I don't care if they have the same value, of course. It does impose it. Why do I like this? Because it means that we can always make a decision between two alternatives. Or each agent can make this decision. So this utility will determine what is optimal within the available policies that we might execute. Now this solution that we then get should be derived from the user utility, so for all the agents. But of course, if we all have the same utility function, for example, if we work for the same company, that leads to a very different thing than if the utility functions can actually differ between different agents. And so how that works through into the solutions that you should aim for will be discussed in part 2 of this tutorial. So Roxana will get back to you soon. Before doing so, however, I would like to go through what we've done so far. So once we have a multi-objective problem, how should we go about doing this? Firstly, we should collect all available information about user utility. So this includes what are the user objectives, and maybe they already have some information about what they will definitely care about. So you can gather here as much data as possible about what users can tell you in advance about their utility. Then you have to decide which policies you will allow or not. For example, there is a big choice between whether you will allow stochastic versus deterministic policies. Now, we tend to not care that much, especially in reinforcement learning, about this difference, and that is because there's always, if you have an infinite horizon problem, then there's always, in quite a lot of settings, you always have a deterministic stationary policy that's optimal. That's no longer the case in multi-objective settings. So you need to make an explicit decision whether you allow stochastic policies or not. And to give you an example of why you might not allow that, imagine a medical treatment example, where you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you I have an excellent treatment program for you, First thing we're going to do is flip a coin, and based on the outcome of the coin flip, we are going to determine which medicine we will give you first. That is very uncomfortable, that you probably don't want to allow stochastic policies there. Okay, then from these, this information, we can derive the optimal solution concept, resulting in resulting from the result of these first 2 points. And then, of course, we can design an algorithm that fits the solution concepts and the model that we aim to use. Furthermore, it is also key that if you need multiple policies that, for your solution concept, then you need to, of course, design a method for the user to select the desired policy from the available alternatives that you will present to them. And this might be all kinds of different things. So this might be the result of a negotiation, but then you need to facilitate the negotiation. Or it might just be, if they're all very cooperative, it might just be having a team meeting in which you select the alternative that you want to execute. All right. So this is the motivation, the basic concepts of the multi-objective problems. Before we go to the next part, are there any questions so far? Henrik? Sorry, I can't quite hear you. Can you give him a microphone? Sorry, it's not on.
That helps, yeah. You were talking about mapping this vector of outcomes to utility now. Doesn't it stop being multi-objective at that point? I mean, unless you have multiple agents that do this in different ways, I guess.
Yeah, so firstly, that's of course one of the main points, that the agents will probably do this in different ways. Also, the reward factors, depending on what type of setting you are in, might not be the same for all the users. But also, just the utility function, even if they all work for the same company, they all have the same utility function, you might not be able to state it explicitly, right? So there might still be, you might have some information, but not all of it. So you might be uncertain about your utility function. Utility function might change over time. So there's quite a lot of things that, that relates to, going too fast. So basically all these points, right? So you might have the utility function might not be entirely known, it might be uncertain, or it might be private to different agents. But also in case of nonlinear ones, then your solution methods will need to change in order to be able to optimize for nonlinear utility functions. So if it's linear, so you have one weight per each objective, and you know that in advance, and it's not private, there's no uncertainty, then you can map it to a single objective problem. But in all other cases, you will need to have the multiple objective modeling explicitly. Thanks. Other questions? All right, then I would like to give the floor to Roxana.
Okay, I hope you can hear me well. Yeah. So for the second part, we will discuss our proposed taxonomy for the field of multi-objective, multi-agent decision making, and then also map a few potential solution concepts that we deem to be appropriate for each identified category. So just a small recap for what Diederik has been laying the foundations of until now. We are looking at vectorial reward functions, payoffs, or whatever you would like to call them. And we are advocating for taking a utility-based perspective. So the only thing we are doing here is assuming that there exists, possibly unknown, as it was just discussed earlier, utility function that can map this vectorial reward, the return, to a scalar value. So more often than not, this utility function will be unknown during our learning or planning phase, which will make us derive an entire solution set that contains optimal behaviors under all possible utility functions. The whole point here is that once you move to an execution phase, there has to be a choice, right? So there has to be, at some point, a choice made among all these possible solution sets. And what I will first discuss before introducing the taxonomy is what are the possible ways of combining or applying the utility function to our vector values. From a mathematical perspective, when we are discussing nonlinear utility functions, we will have two options. And I will try to explain these two options by grounding them in the example of buying a house. So, I will make a distinction between the case in which we have an individual family purchasing a house versus, for example, a real estate investor. So you can imagine that once you have this situation, purchasing a house, you will have to consider a myriad of objectives. So, for example, you will have to look at the neighborhood, the taxation reports, the layout of your residential unit, and so on. If you think about it from the perspective of a family that wants to purchase a house, you will have to understand that they will derive the utility from the action of purchasing a house after this individual policy execution, right? Because they are looking for a long-term investment. They are buying a house in which they will live for the next years or decades. So therefore, they will have to consider very carefully their objectives because they are deriving their utility from this single purchase. In this case, what we would like then to optimize for is what we will call the expected scalarized returns criteria. So in other words, we would like to calculate the expectation of the utilities from the payoffs. I will show in a second the mathematical formulation so you can see how to formulate this. So again, ESR is appropriate when the user derives their utility from every single policy application. In contrast to that, if you think about an investor, he will have a certain budget or portfolio that are larger, and this could allow him to play the averages. So for example, he could start submitting bids faster and so on, as long as the average outcome is desirable enough for him or her. So in this case, what the investor could desire to optimize for is what we call the scalarized expected return criterion, because he can derive his utility from several executions of the policy. So I hope you can take this example with you to really ground the distinction between the potential optimization criteria. And from a mathematical perspective, and I'm exemplifying here perhaps you're familiar with the reinforcement learning problem. So you will see here your discounted sum of, in this case, vectorial rewards, given a certain policy and initial state distribution. And in the ESR case, we will want to immediately scalarize and only afterwards take the expectation, while for SCR, we will first take the expectation over our discounted sum of vectorial rewards and afterwards scalarize. Again, the choice of this optimization criteria is important. It does lead to different solutions in the case, of course, of nonlinear utility functions. And what drives or what should drive the selection of this criterion is really what the user is interested in optimizing. Okay, so Diederik also outlined why in multi-objective, multi-agent systems, the elements that determine what would represent a solution when we follow a utility-based approach are the reward function as well as the utility function. And that is why what we propose here is a taxonomy based on these two elements, and we make a distinction between two types of reward functions: team reward versus individual rewards. So we avoid calling it perhaps cooperative settings because it becomes a bit more complicated than that. So in a team reward setting, each agent will receive the same value for executing the policy, while in an individual reward setting, each agent receives a different value vector. We also make a distinction in three types of utilities. We have our team utility, where each agent just serves the same interest and has the same preference as over the objectives. A social choice utility setting. The idea is that we are interested in optimizing for the overall social welfare. I will go a bit more into detail in a second. Or an individual utility setting where each agent follows its own agenda and just optimizes for that. You will notice that we are missing over here one element, namely individual reward, team utility. Why is that? Well, due to the fact that the rewards being individual, the outcome, even if we apply the same utility function, will still end up in different elements. So, syntactically speaking, we can consider that the same as individual rewards, individual utilities. However, I do acknowledge that semantically speaking, there might be a distinction to say that, wait a bit, actually, my agents are on the same team. But we can leave that to the designers of the problem. The solution concepts we derive here will still apply. And of course, we also note that the utility function can still be applied according to the two optimization criteria I detailed a few seconds ago. I will give you a series of examples for each of these categories in the hopes that perhaps it will inspire you to already understand or ground your own potential problems into one of the categories. So for example, for the team reward, team utility setting, the case would be, for example, a company that aims to be environmentally responsible while maximizing profits. All the agents are working for this company and they want to achieve the same goal together. They obtain the same values and they have the same utility function. What I am detailing here on the right side is the scalarized expected return criterion scheme for this setting. So we will have always our joint policy applied to our environment, deriving the value vector value, and then scalarizing it appropriately. In the social choice setting, in real life, we usually observe this whenever we have a highway setting where we introduce tolls to regulate traffic flow. So all the agents are sharing the same infrastructure, they receive the same rewards while traveling. However, they might have different preferences for taking these trips, but we can try to regulate and avoid congestion with the use of tolls. Team reward individual utility. Well, this setting basically takes place every time you are trying to plan a trip or an event with your friends. You will always end up with the same return, right? You are going to the same holiday, but you might have different preferences over the budget, the cost, the type of transportation, and so on. And you can immediately understand perhaps here that every time you're utilities differ, it becomes more and more challenging to come to an agreement. And this will also be reflected in this type of systems. Individual rewards, social choice. Perhaps a good example here would be bidding-free auctions. Everyone will end up getting a different outcome from the auction, and this can be regulated with certain fees. Again, it's very similar to the previous case. This time it's just individual rewards. And individual reward, individual utility, it's very common in all our day-to-day interactions whenever we are participating in traffic, working and so on. And you can imagine this will be the most general and difficult scenario to solve. Now, because after going through this taxonomy, we would like to also propose a mapping of potential solution concepts to each of our identified settings. So you'll see three main categories over here that I will discuss. Main coverage sets, solution concept that comes from multi-objective optimization, mechanism design, under, of course, the social choice element, and finally, equilibrium and stability concepts, solution concept that comes from multi-agent systems. So, coverage sets contain at least one optimal policy for each possible utility function. That's simply their definition. And in the team reward, team utility case, we can simply think about this as an appropriate solution concept because it would apply in the same way in the single agent multi-objective scenario, right? Because everyone is working for the same company in this case, so there is only one single utility function. So in this case, it would be appropriate if the utility function is unknown to just simply construct the entire set of solutions, and once the utility is known, apply it and select the best option. For the team reward individual utility case, we would need some extra steps. In this case, the agents no longer have the same interests, so we would need some negotiation phase to agree among agents on which policy to execute. And again, this is not straightforward. We don't know yet. It's an open question on how to do this appropriately. And finally, coverage sets could also be a potential solution concept in the most general case, individual rewards, individual utilities. And the way we can look at this is that every agent would simply learn a coverage set representing the best responses to the behaviors of other agents. While this is in theory possible, it will become quickly infeasible, of course, depending on how large your problem is. Social welfare and mechanism design, well, in this case, the idea is to take the system's perspective, and we should have the possibility of designing a function W that would force the agents to be truthful about their activities and would lead to an optimal welfare in this case. I'm not an expert in this field, but again, there is so much more to be done in this direction. Okay, finally, equilibrium and stability concepts. So basically, all the solution concepts you are familiar with from multi-agent systems can be ported to multi-objective settings as well. In simple words, we are looking for stable outcomes from which each of our self-interested agents has no incentive to deviate. And here we can talk about Nash equilibria, correlated equilibria, cyclic equilibria, collision formation, and so on. Perhaps I will go into a bit more details for Nash equilibrium, just to demonstrate how it would look like to apply it in a multi-objective, multi-agent setting. So, as you might well know, a Nash equilibrium is a joint policy from which no agent can improve his or her utility by unilaterally deviating. Now, because we are in a multi-objective multi-agent setting, we will always have these two possibilities: Nash equilibria under the scalarized expected return criterion or under expected scalarized returns. And then the definition will look very similar to what you are familiar with, except of course you will have the distinction between where you apply your expectation versus the utility function. And in the third part, we will actually present a few interesting results of properties or unexistence of Nash equilibrium under these different criteria. Other interesting solution concepts that we have looked at are cyclic Nash equilibrium. So here the idea is very similar, but in this case the agents will be cycling through a set of strategies. Or correlated equilibrium, I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're a bit more different. They are usually discussed, well, they imply the existence of a correlated strategy, or in other words, a probability distribution over the joint action space of the agents. And it also requires the capacity of having some external mechanism that can sample from this correlated strategy and then privately communicate to the agents a correlation signal. And this correlated strategy is a correlated equilibrium if no agent has an incentive to deviate from the given recommendation of the correlated signal. A small example of understanding correlated equilibrium in real life are traffic lights. The external mechanism is simply a traffic light, right? So you know that if you see red, you have no incentive to drive through the intersection because with 100% chance, people driving from perpendicular directions will see green. Okay, and just a small example to ground these concepts. So I have here a multi-objective normal form game. 2 players, 2 actions, and let's assume each of the agents has the same utility function that simply consists in multiplying the 2 payouts, 1 for each objective. It's a very simple game, so it's very easy to see that action AA, joint action A and BB are both Nash equilibria. Agents have no incentive to deviate from these 2 points because they will always incur a decrease in their utility. Each of these Nash equilibria has an expected utility of 20. I mentioned here that I'm looking at the scalarized expected returns case, namely the agents interact multiple times. In the case of cyclic Nash equilibrium, you can also imagine that, or an example of a joint cyclic strategy would be each player cycling through actions A and B. This means 50% of the time they will be playing AA, 50% of the time they will be playing B. In expectation, this would give them a value of 6 in each of the objectives, with an expected utility, final utility of 36. I won't say more about this, but it already foreshadows a few of the results from our last part. Correlated strategies and correlated equilibrium. An example here would be the correlated strategy 50% AA, 50% BB. Imagine you have a device that can sample from this. If it samples AA, it will communicate this recommendation to each of the agents. Same for BB. Agents will have no incentive to deviate from the recommendation because otherwise they would simply get something less. And this has the same outcome as the previous example. Means on average, agents will be playing 50% of the time AA, 50% of the time BB, with the same potential expected utility. Okay, so this was a very brief introduction to the taxonomy we proposed for multi-objective multi-agent domains and our solution concepts. So we have a few minutes before the coffee break for questions now. Yes.
Thank you. When we look at this slide, I struggle with understanding what's the point of computing the expectation of the return and then scalarizing it, because this outcome, this utility of 36, is not achievable in reality. It's completely illusory, right? You'll always get 20, no matter which combination of A or B you choose on these times. So wouldn't it only be correct to scalarize first and then compute it?
So it depends again on the type of the problem we're modeling, if it's a repeated interaction type or not. And we are considering here repeated interactions. And this again comes back to all the examples you heard in the first part. So even traveling, so commuting to work, for example, if you have a budget overall, then you can afford to just take expectation over multiple policy executions. Or if you have some strict budgets per day or strict arrival times, then indeed you would want to scalarize after every policy execution. So it really depends on how and what you want to optimize for. But indeed, it's a different perspective that you need to look at.
I don't see it. It's just not possible to get 36.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let me make that example more concrete. When you say that if you don't need to work, and you do care about the environment, but in a different way. So what you're saying is, I can take the bicycle or take the car to work. And now and of course, for every single day of doing this, and I might be part of the right, so we refer together, so I can buy mine or car. But then what you're saying as well, the only people get our car. However, any strategy that will allow you to say, okay, we're going to take the price of the most that someone has to take the car, implies that you are carrying out an average. So there are definitely settings in which you carry out an average. Rather than single out, but of course that depends on where you count on the horizon where you're expecting this game or similar games more times than once. But also in the housing example, the individual family is buying a house will only get one outcome ever. Get that house. But an investor has this whole set of things that are playing in parallel with all kinds of functions of different houses. So they can afford to play evidence.
So, if I understand correctly, in these settings, you're interested in actually the sum over many executions of this game, and that's what makes it possible to have more different outcomes than you can see in the game.
Well, this is not a non-existent outcome. It's playing the strategy.
Yes, but if we go to work 10 times, for example, then we don't only have the car and bike solution, but we have all the combinations of how many times we choose car and how many times bike, right?
But so this becomes a bit more complex in the investor setting, where I'm participating in this game in one day, but in all kinds of different games, and I still care about averages, because I expect to average out over multiple different games. The average is more, but then the secondary expected values is a key, so it's a key thing to do in order to keep these things tracked. Actually, enumerate all possible outcomes across, different days.
Any other questions? Okay, so now then it is time for a half-an-hour coffee break, and we hope to see you back at 3:30 for the last part, latest results and open challenges. So for this last part, we will discuss a few of the latest results in multi-objective multi-agent decision-making, and we will end with a few open challenges and an open conversation on perhaps settings you might be interested in, and so on. So perhaps this would have been better moved at the start, but let me start with a formal definition of multi-objective normal form games. As you have seen earlier in the Venn diagram, they are the multi-objective counterparts of normal form games. So stateless settings, and they consist of the following tuple. We have n, the set of players. Each player has his set of actions, and in contrast to normal form games, the payoff is now a vector, with every component representing the payoff for each of the C or N or D considered objectives. And before introducing the first theoretical result, let me present or introduce the imbalancing act game. So this multi-objective normal form game has two players, two objectives, and each player in this case receives the same payoff vector. So for example, if they would play action LL, each player would receive the following vector of vectorial payoff, 4, 0. If they play LM, they would receive each the vector 3, 1. The actions, we have three actions, LMR, that stand for left, middle, right, for example. Now, what's interesting about the imbalancing act game is it was designed with a certain dynamics in mind. So, for example, we have assigned the following utility function for player 1. It's the sum of the squared elementary values of the objectives. Well, the utility function for player 2 is the multiplication of the values of the objectives. To give you an intuition of what these utility functions entail, I will simply just, you can notice that player 1, due to his or her utility function, will have a preference or will receive higher utility values from imbalanced outcomes. So for example, he or she will actually prefer 4, 0 or 0, 4, because this will result in the highest utility. While the other player, due to its utility function, will have a preference towards balanced outcomes. So the maximum would be achieved in 2, 2, right? And 3, 1 or 1, 3, this is a middle, is preferred, it says the second preference of each player. So hence the imbalancing act game. One player would like to tip the scale towards imbalanced outcomes, the other one towards balanced elements. And using this game, we will demonstrate the first theoretical consideration in finite multi-objective normal form games. If the agents are seeking to optimize or to maximize their utility under scalarized expected returns, Nash equilibria need not exist. So you have to remember scalarized expected returns implies the setting of repeated interactions where the players or the agents are interested in the expected returns, so playing the averages. In the previous example, when I introduced the criteria, these were the investors that were that had a large budget and a large portfolio and could afford to play the averages in house bidding wars and so on. And why? Just to give you an intuition for the proof, you need to understand or consider that any mixed strategy, so any probability distribution that the player might have over his or her actions, will lead here to the same expected payoff vector for both the agents, right? They are receiving the same payoff. However, due to the structure of the utility functions, agent, so if the, let's say, expected payoff is balanced somewhere in the vicinity of 2, agent 1, due to the structure of its utility function, will always have an incentive to deterministically take action left or right in order to compensate and to shift the outcome towards a more imbalanced one, because that's what would give him a higher utility. While if the expected payoff would be imbalanced, then player 2 would again have an incentive to deviate. So that we can actually just show that at least one of the agents will always have an incentive to deviate from its strategy, and resulting in no Nash equilibrium. If you want to revert back to the Nash equilibrium proof in normal form games, what I can tell you that breaks it is the nonlinearity introduced by our utility functions. What I would also like to offer here is a novel intuition of why such games are not guaranteed to have a Nash equilibrium. I will also mention that this is still a very recent result by our PhD student Willem Robke, and he has shown that there is a correspondence between multi-objective normal form games with continuous utility functions and continuous games. So small introduction, continuous games simply imply the fact that the players have now an infinite number of pure strategies that they can choose from, and they are single objective. Just an intuition on how this correspondence works. Well, simply every mixed strategy or every potential strategy of our multi-objective normal form game can be mapped to a pure strategy in a continuous game. This is, in the paper, if you look it up, you will see that he also gives a few examples on how to do that. But for now, I would like you to just have the correspondence or the intuition between the correspondence. Every mixed strategy in a multi-objective normal form game can be seen as a pure strategy in a continuous game. And the result, or it's already known that continuous games are not guaranteed to have pure strategy Nash equilibria. So it follows quite easily the fact that Nash equilibria are not guaranteed in multi-objective normal form games. So this is just a novel intuition, a novel perspective you can take on understanding why multi-objective normal form games might not have Nash equilibria if you are looking at nonlinear utility functions and you are considering the setting of repeated interactions under the scalarized expected return criterion. Next, I would like to invite back Diederik, and he will discuss a bit more on what we can still do to mitigate this issue and still guarantee existence of equilibrium.
Thank you very much. So I will just briefly go through some very recent results on multi-objective, multi-agent systems. And so the first nice one is that existence of Nash equilibria is not guaranteed in general, but it is guaranteed again when we impose the restriction that all utility functions, so the utility functions of each agent, is quasi-convex. And so these are called what they, in economics, they often call like well-behaved preferences. And it basically means you get some kind of diminished utility from gaining more and more. So, quasi-convex utility function, for example, this function here is a quasi-convex utility function. I gain more and more in a certain objective, and then the additional extra utility I get from it is decreasing. And this happens quite a lot in economics. And the intuition here again, but so in the previous slide, this was still an intuition, like I can map a mixed strategy and I can call that a pure strategy in a continuous game. Here, it's still called intuition, but actually this is a full proof, right? So yes, we can map this multi-objective normal form game to a continuous game. And as long as we know that the utility functions are all going to be quasi-convex, then it's known in these games that if you have these quasi-convex utility functions, you translate that to the payoff function in a continuous game, then for those type of quasi-convex payoff structures, then again, Nash equilibria are guaranteed, and so this follows from a known result in continuous games. The nasty thing, however, is that it does not hold for if you go the opposite way. So if you have strict convex utility functions, for example, these ones that really seek to get complete imbalance here, then again we lose the Nash equilibrium guarantees for multi-objective normal form games. Good. And one of the and so this is one of the games for which this is indeed the case, because of these and here you can also again see that, for example, if I'm here, then one of the agents will have a incentive to deviate. And here, actually, I can assume that the utility functions for both agents are equal, and here this is nice strictly convex thing. And then if I'm here, then the second agent will have 2, 2, but the first agent will have 0, 1. But then actually this one looks better, so then I want to deviate, and this holds for any type of mixed strategy. And if you would like to write this out on paper, then it's a nice exercise to actually do. Because of course this applies to strict convex utility functions, this also directly applies to more general classes that include this class, right? So quasi-convex utility functions are a superclass of strict convex utility functions, so it also applies to that. All right, then of course, if we have this kind of thing, then what can we still do? Well, one of the things that you might consider is that an agent might actually a priori commit to a certain action that will be played. And if I can communicate that at the start, then of course I can, then you might think that this might be exploitable because I give the other agent information. But the nice thing about this is it might actually be better than any type of Nash equilibrium. And even in single objective games, this type of strategy can actually lead to much better payoffs than having an actual, than just trying to play for an Nash equilibrium. So these are called so-called leaderships equilibria. That is, the leader announces which action it will take. And the leader cannot improve their utility given that the follower player displays the best response to that. So I'm just going to announce, hey, I'm going to play A, and then you can play your best response. And then if I can't improve my utility by announcing a different action or a different strategy, then that's called a leadership equilibrium. So this prescribes how an opponent, however, selects their best response. And it can nicely be shown that this type of commitment can actually lead to much nicer payoffs. For example, it can be better than any type of Nash equilibria. So here my Nash equilibria are, what am I doing? So here my Nash equilibria are going, it's not this. So this commitment can actually be better than all Nash equilibria because the Nash equilibrium has this, what we call a fixed point death trap, which is to say, if I need to play a strategy for which none of the agents has an incentive to deviate, then that can actually lead to a strategy that is actually very bad for both players. For example, the prisoner's dilemma game is a good example of this, right? So actually, the only Nash equilibrium prisoner's dilemma is very bad for both agents. Okay, and a commitment strategy may avoid this by just saying, hey, I'm going to play this, you can play your best response, and it can actually be better for both of us. So also here, if you have your different Nash equilibrium, if I can announce it, then it's quite easy to see what the other player should do. If I say I'm going to play A, then the other player is going to play A. So leadership equilibrium here is also a Nash equilibrium, but there are other games in which, if I announce my strategy beforehand, it's actually better than a Nash equilibrium. And also in cases where I can play a nice mix. And so if I'm saying I'm going to play A now, then the next time I'm going to announce B, then I can get to these nice mixtures as well. Good. Of course, this also leads to that we have these joint cyclic strategies where I can announce what I'm going to play in different iterations of this game. And so these nice cyclic strategies may actually outperform anything that is just a fixed index equilibrium. Good. Now there are some different theoretical considerations here. Firstly, that commitment is not actually guaranteed to be as good as a Nash equilibrium. This might sound counterintuitive because in a single objective game, if I announce that I can play a certain action, and that's part of a Nash equilibrium, then by definition the other agent would have an incentive to deviate. But if an agent commits to a strategy, it can show that this can be exploited. And if you want to know the details of this, this is in Willem's upcoming work. Now, there's also another very nice result. Recent result is that cyclic Nash equilibrium may exist when no stationary equilibrium does exist. And so this is nice. So even if we have no nice Nash equilibrium, we can still. There is still an opportunity that we might still have a stable cyclic Nash equilibrium. And so this actually provides a valid alternative for learning strategy, right? And Willem actually has done some experiments that has where some cyclic strategies can be learned over just a standard Nash equilibrium. All right. Another very interesting thing to see is that if we have these two different optimization criteria, then we might start to compare whether the equilibria under one criterion have any correspondence to the equilibria under the other criterion. And so the first, well, you might call it a bit of a negative result, is that actually no relation between Nash equilibria exists between the optimization criteria in general. For example, if you see this game, I realized that we forgot to include the utility function, but you can see, so here, if you just apply the utility function directly, you would get this scalarized game. I think it's the product, and then, I don't remember, but if you, Do you remember? What was it again? So it's the product between the two objectives. So payoff 1 times payoff 2 plus, and then 0.1 times the payoff in the first objective. I think that was the thing. And so then you would get 0.1 for AA, because it's just 0.1 of the first objective, but the product would lead to a 0 because it's 1 times 0 for both agents. And then, of course, it's also very negative. So this should actually be -1 for both agents, -10 here. But then the nice thing is that, so for the scalarized utility, so the expected scalarized utility criterion, this would be the sole Nash equilibrium, because this is the only one that gives any positive returns. But if you actually move to the scalarized expected returns criterion, then you can have a mixture between AA and AB, or so these two strategies, or these two strategies that actually improve upon this, because you can get some reward in both criteria. So this is actually one of these things where you could get a better strategy with a mixed. Or you could get a better outcome under SER by using a mixed strategy. However, because that is better than the pure strategy AA under SER, you can see that there are two mixed Nash equilibria under SER, while there's just one and a pure strategy under ESR. So then this shows that there are no necessarily any sharing of Nash equilibria under the two optimization criteria. However, if we then look at pure strategies only, if there are pure Nash equilibria, then any pure strategy Nash equilibrium under SER is also one under ESR, if we assume quasi-convex utility functions. And we can even extend this to blended settings, where one agent is playing SER and the other agent is playing ESR. And this might also happen, right, though? Like, for example, in this investor example that we gave earlier, if I have a single family who's bidding for a house, they're playing ESR, while the investor is playing SER. So you might also get these blended settings where some of the agents are interested in different optimization criteria. Okay, so these are just some of the results. I realize that we don't supply like proper proofs for this, but they're all in the papers, and if you're interested in them, I would. So there's a list of papers at the end where all these results are given. Now then, besides this recent field, there's still quite a lot of open questions. For example, when can we guarantee that commitment cannot be exploited? So are there conditions that we can give where we know for sure that this commitment cannot be exploited? What is the link between correlated equilibria and hierarchical equilibria? So it's a different concept again. And then, of course, how to extend this Stackelberg-like thing where you do your commitment beyond two agents and you just go to n-player games, which is still open for multi-objective settings. And then, of course, efficient learning algorithms is something that is rather much in its infancy for multi-objective, multi-agent games. All right. And then finally, of course, we've shown results quite a lot for multi-objective normal form games. This is also because this is one of the easier settings also conceptually to visualize. However, of course, more real-world problems are going to be more complex than that. And as I showed you in the beginning, we have this entire Venn diagram of ever increasingly complex multi-agent, multi-objective decision problems. And there aren't a lot of results there for the more complex settings, like sequential, partially observable settings. The other thing that we might need is really trying to engineer these integrated pipelines. So we've shown that sometimes you can produce a covered set of a multi-objective, multi-agent problem, but then you need to do the negotiation and then you need to do the execution. Is this really going to work in practice? And what then if you can do partial negotiation over partial results? So this truly integrated pipeline and how this will affect the planning versus, so the computing of solutions versus interaction with the users. Can you intertwine that? Can you have this nice interactive setting? This is still completely not studied at all. There's quite a bit of more of utility modeling that needs to be done. Can we actually derive another agent's utility function from his behavior? This is quite an open question, so it's also a very difficult one, because of course different utility functions might lead to the same kind of behavior. So if you want to model the other agent's utility, can we at least construct a model that sufficiently explains the other agent's behavior and can predict more new behavior in the future? So this is also very much an open question. And then finally, because we know that utility functions are typically private, when is it strategic to divulge some of my preference information to the other agents, and when is it not? And this is also something that is quite difficult, and this is especially important if we want to go to mechanism design, because then we want to incentivize the agents to actually be truthful about their preferences, right? So how do we get to this? And this is also, again, still a completely open, there's a wide open field here. And finally, and this is something that any good field should have, is a proper set of benchmarks with different properties where we can go. We have been using a set of benchmark problems for our own research, of course, but we do acknowledge that it's actually quite far from complete. All right. With that, I am going to close the tutorial. So first of all, thank you very much for listening. Or as it says here, gosecho arigatou gozaimasu. I'm also, I've recently returned from Japan, and there's this very nice illustration website where I can steal all these nice illustrations. So that's why it's in Japanese. I also speak Japanese, by the way. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now, or if you just want to read the slides again, they're up on the webpage, so you can go through them again. If you then have questions later, please drop us a message. We'll be here the entire week, so you can just see if you can find us, or you can send us a message on Wova, or just email, whatever you prefer. Okay, thank you again for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions right now. I don't see any questions yet. Let me ask you a question for you. How was this tutorial? Is it, were you all able to follow it? Because I realize there's quite a lot of new information out there, or were you a bit overwhelmed? Doable? All right, that's good to hear. Are there any questions or open problems? Fernando? Yes. Yeah, so just for those who couldn't hear the questions, like if we have this commitment, do we assume that we are actually going to fulfill this commitment, or can we be deceitful about it? So this is a good thing. Yes, so we are actually assuming here that we are going to fulfill our commitment. Also because else it basically reduces back to the original problem. Because if I can just give you any random signal, then what's basically, but then I can completely choose any strategy I want, then of course this signal doesn't mean anything. So we're back to the original problem. The only thing that it could be used for is some kind of coordination signal, but then the agent would have to learn what the coordination signals actually means. So then, yeah, so that's again a difficult problem.
Thanks for the problem.
Any other questions? Any practical problems? Yes. Sure.
So instead of a vector, when I do get a scalar utility, am I not in my head doing something like ESR, SEO? Am I getting the analogy?
So yes, in a sense, if you do ESR, so you're computing the utility based on the vectors that you have here. Then what you're going to do is you're going to scalarize this vector before, and so you're scalarizing the outcomes, which will bring you back to a standard normal form game. But there's one major exception here, and that is that while in a normal form game you know the other agent's utility, because you know which scalar outcomes there are, here you can only observe this and you don't know the other agent's actual utility. So that's a fundamental difference still. So yes, in a sense, if both agents play ESR and the utility functions would be known, you're back in the single objective setting. But because you don't actually know, then the learning problem might actually be more difficult because you don't know what the other agent's preferences are. So you have to learn something about that through interaction. Right. Any other questions? If not, then, Bill, yes.
Yes, so from October, I will start my funding on sequential team reward settings. So that's the first step I decided to go towards, sequential settings, but team reward. I expect it already to be a challenge, so look to just hopefully in the next 3 years for more results on that.
And of course, if you want the completely intractable answer, then it's if I have, for example, a multi-objective, multi-agent, like a multi-objective stochastic game, I could actually try and write that out all the way back to a normal form game formulated. It's just that it's completely intractable, but the theoretical results should still apply. All right. Okay, then thank you for listening, and we'll be around.